Okay, well, I'm Robert Frieden, a professor in the Linguistics program at Princeton University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this talk by Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky began work on generative grammar as a senior at the University of Pennsylvania in a senior thesis in 1949, and has continued since then with hard to describe the output. Puts most of us to shame. And he's still a major contributor in the field. I give you Noam Chomsky.
Thanks. Well, Bob asked me to say a few words about where I think the field has gone in roughly 60 plus years. As he made clear, it's obviously a personal perspective. Other people see it very differently, maybe rightly. Since he mentioned 1949, and since I'm supposed to start from the beginning, if you don't mind a personal anecdote, one of the things that got me interested in the field, actually around 1946, was the realization that the Bible is mistranslated. The Bible begins, in the beginning, God created. That's mistranslation. That's a mistranslation based on a grammatical error by the Masoretic scholars who put the vowels in around the 8th century. Any of you know Hebrew, you ought to be able to figure out pretty quickly what the error is. It's been mistranslated for 1,000 years. And I figured at the time, if the first couple of words of the Bible can be wrong in the authoritative text and wrong in the translation, and nobody noticed it for 1,000 years, there's got to be something interesting to learn about language. And in fact, the more you look, the more you find that everything is misunderstood. And when you think about it a little more, that's not terribly surprising. That's the way the history of science has worked. So if you take a look at, say, the Galilean revolutions around 1600 and afterwards, what it was mainly, to a large extent, based on was the discovery that everything everyone believed was wrong about very simple things. So for millennia, there was an answer to a very simple question. If this cup is full of water, boiling water, let's say, and I let go of it, the cup will fall and the steam will rise. And there was a classical answer to that from Aristotelian science. They're seeking their natural place. And for thousands of years, that was considered a fine answer, except Galileo and a couple of others decided to be puzzled about it. And as soon as they were, they saw at once it's not an answer. And as soon as you looked a little further, you found that all your intuitions about falling bodies are totally wrong, and there modern science starts. And my own feeling is we've been in a kind of pre-Galilean stage, and we've just got to learn, and by now everybody who's worked in the field knows they don't have to learn, that you just have to be puzzled by the very simplest phenomena. In fact, look at a corpus or open a book and pick out the first sentence, and it's puzzling. Why should it be that way, not some other way? And just about everything you look at is just as in the physical world. And my own aha or Leibniz was when I realized that the words in the beginning were mistranslated, and a mistranslation that actually is based on a grammatical error that went back 1,000 years, and it's transparent. As soon as you look at it, if you know anything about Hebrew grammar, you see this is impossible. It's grammatically impossible. And it's also clear what it was supposed to be. Remember, they put in vowels. The consonants were there, and they put the vowels in wrong. But, so that's in the beginning. Well, things kind of began to get crystal. There's other things to say about that, but I won't talk about it. But by the early 50s, things were kind of beginning to fall into place. There was an orthodoxy, strict orthodoxy. I was at Harvard, kind of main intellectual center in these areas. And there's dual orthodoxy. One was structural linguistics, and the other was behavioral psychology. And the two meshed, though they didn't say so. There were about 3 people who didn't believe the orthodoxy. Grad students, that's where things usually come from. I was one, Morris Halley, long friend and colleague, was another. And the third was Eric Lenneberg, who went on to found biology of language. And we talked to each other and started reading things and doing various things. And gradually some ideas began to crystallize, which only became clearer considerably later, so this will be anachronistic. But that's the way things usually are, as you know, you sort of think you understand something, and 20 years later you see you really did understand it, but you didn't know you understood it, and so on. Some of these assumptions that began to take shape seem to me as if they ought to be truisms. In fact, they are truisms, but they're highly contested. In fact, vigorously denied right to the present. So maybe it's worth mentioning them. One thing that is and should be regarded as a truism is that language is spoken by people. Doesn't sound very remarkable. So it's something that individuals do. And they don't do it because of something in their feet, you know. They do it because of something mostly in their brains. So language capacity must be a biological property that's mostly in some part of the brain. We now know some things about where and how, but it's just got to be there, which means that the core problem of language should be viewed from the point of view of what years later came to be called biolinguistics, the study of a internal, individual, biological property which manifests itself in action, like others. You know, say motor organization or vision or anything else. It should be just normal science, study of some biological capacity. And I think that's true of all cognitive capacities, but that's another story which I won't go into, also highly contested. A second assumption, which is again, should be obvious, it gradually became clear, is actually an insight that goes back to Descartes. I think he was the first to formulate it with any clarity. And that is that ordinary use of language, and let me stress use, has a kind of creative capacity, normal, ordinary use of language. So it's constantly innovative, it's unbounded, it's appropriate to circumstances, typically, but not caused by circumstances, or even elicited by them, which is a critical difference, which wasn't understood then and isn't understood now, and is actually the basis for most of Cartesian science, what's called philosophy. Well, it's kind of interesting that you don't find this in the long history of the subject. In fact, the only person I've been able to find, maybe some scholars here can fill in details, is Galileo, who had a kind of a weak version of it, but he was talking about the alphabet, which is a reflection of this capacity, not the capacity. That one was pointed out to me by Erwin Panofsky, who you may know, great scholar. But if there's anything else, I haven't found it. It's perfectly obvious from a moment's thought that that's what language use is, but not there. If you get the modern period, virtually nothing. In fact, if you, which is an interesting question in itself, how can these obvious things not only not be seen, but be vigorously and often passionately denied, you know, up to the present? Well, that's the second. Actually, about 50, when I got interested in history, I started looking at it considerably, and I did find some later things which brought it up. There's a phrase of von Humboldt's I've quoted a number of times that has been very seriously misunderstood. Maybe my fault, but by now it's widely used. And language involves infinite use of finite means. That's what he said, exactly what he meant. You know, not so obvious, pretty obscure if you read it. But whatever it was, he was talking about use. Okay, he was talking about infinite use of finite means. Now, we know nothing about the infinite use. I mean, essentially, just that it's there. But we've learned a lot about the means. In fact, most of the work in the last 60-odd years is about the means that enter into the infinite use, which leaves us a long distance away from the classical and very intriguing problems about what is it about human. It may be totally human, as Descartes thought. We don't know that that's wrong. But whatever it is, it's an elementary fact about humans, manifests itself in other ways, kind of the core of human nature. We don't understand it, don't know how to study it. But you can get in some areas, and language is one of them, one of the very few, you can learn a lot about the means that are put to use. Different question, but an interesting one. Well, that's the conclusion from that, I think, in retrospect, should have been obvious a couple thousand years ago. Certainly should have been obvious in 1950, is that you should study language from what's later been called the biolinguistic perspective, and with a focus on what's now called I language, at least what I call I language, which is just grammar in one of the earlier uses of the term grammar, ambiguous term. So this was a technical proposal to get rid of the ambiguity. So some system that's internal, individual, and thanks to English spelling, is viewed intentionally with an S. So you're interested in the actual procedure, not the, it's kind of irrelevant what the output of the procedure is. It's some ancillary phenomenon, a corpus or something like that. It's data, not what you're looking at. So that's I language, earlier years grammar, same concept, nothing new except the term. So an I language means some kind of generative procedure. Any system of means that's infinite, unbounded, has got to have, we now understand, has to have some generative procedure that, recursive procedure that characterizes it. And that's what you're interested in, the actual procedure, not its output. Actually, some years later, this was discussed in a kind of an interesting way, but a somewhat orthogonal, which is also not understood, by Dave Marr, who I know pretty well, and was actually using grammatical models. And he, as you should know, developed an approach to cognitive science generally, which separated the computational level, which is kind of like a characterization of the problem, the algorithmic level, where you have a procedure that deals with the problem, and I forget what he called it, the material level, where you look at how it's all working out in the brain. The analogy was supposed to be something like competence and performance, but it's not quite the same, because he was studying, and this is quite important, he was studying input processes, vision. And for input processes, yes, there's an algorithm. So you can study the problem of, say, three-dimensional vision, how do object recognition, you can state what the problem is, computational level. You can look at the algorithm by which it's carried out, which is quite surprising when you look at it. It has very odd properties, which nobody ever knew until recently. And you can look at the mechanisms. But for a competent system, a generative system like language, there's no algorithm. And nothing is being done, It's just a characterization of an infinite set, finite characterization of an infinite set. But there's no algorithm, so you can't carry over the Marr model for this. Actually, this is kind of similar to Jerry Fodor's work on modularity, which you may know. His modules are input systems, but the kind of modules that are studied and should be studied, in my view, in cognitive science theories are central systems. Different, Randy Gallistel's work is like this. That's what I always meant by it. So and that's what Jerry says can't exist, can't be a modular central system, but it has to. There has to be internal modules that do particular things, and they are not input or output systems. So you have to be really careful about applying these notions. Sound similar, but not quite. It's, I mean, the sort of core question you have to answer once you adopt this kind of framework, I mean, the most elementary question is, what's a language? It's again interesting to see how this question is ignored in the literature of a couple thousand years. It's instructive to take a look. So take the modern period, you know, Saussure, Bloomfield, Quine, philosopher, who did most of the work on it. The only proposals about what language is make absolutely no sense at all as soon as you look at them. In fact, Quine gives contradictory answers on almost the same pages, neither of which makes any sense. One of his answers is essentially taken from Bloomfield, who defines, you know, the great, in his book, Language. Language is the totality of expressions that are used in a speech community. That's completely meaningless. You know, I won't talk about it, but think about it. One of Quine's proposals is about the same. The other one contradicts it. If you look back at Saussure, there's essentially nothing. I mean, it's a social contract of some kind. Well, okay, but it doesn't tell you anything about languages. What language has to be, the core question, is at least a generative process. At least that. In other words, an I language, which is just a generative process. And then come questions about what it is. Well, there are plenty of other questions to ask about language, significant ones. Acquisition, use, if you could possibly study it, which you can't in any serious way, neural representation, history, diachronic linguistics, evolution of language, which is incredibly confused with historical linguistics in modern work in an astonishing fashion. If some time I'll come back to it. But those are all questions you can investigate. But for any of them, you can proceed only as far as you have some characterization of what a language is. Like, you can't study acquisition of language unless you know what language is. Now, you don't have to know everything, of course. You know, like you can study evolution of the eye without knowing everything about the eye. But it's certainly not enough just to know that eyes are used to watch television. I mean, no biologist would study the evolution of the eye on that basis. But you take a look at the work on what's called evolution of language, it's exactly what it is. Language is used for communication, sometimes, and a million other things. So therefore, we'll study that. And of course, you get zero results, as you would if you studied evolution of the eye, knowing nothing except it's used to watch television. Now, these ought to be elementary observations. That's kind of embarrassing to talk about them, except that they're rampant in current work in the field, and we should ask why. For a lot of you, that's the field you're getting into. Well, there's another truism, or ought to be, and that is that there's some genetic component in humans that makes it possible for us to do what we're doing, but makes it impossible for, you know, we're called our nearest relatives, you know, 10 million years apart, say chimpanzees. They have about the same auditory system that humans have. That's been recently discovered. In fact, they even pick out the same phonetic features that are used in distinctive features in language. However, if you, say, have a chimpanzee and your, you know, baby sister or baby, if you're old enough, are stuck from birth in front of a mass of noise, the infant, human infant, immediately picks out of the noise as something that's language relevant, which is kind of miraculous. Nobody knows how that's done. But they do it instantly, reflexively. Some of it we now know is even prenatally. On the other hand, for another animal with the same auditory system, it's just noise. And it goes the other way too. Other organisms will pick out relevant material from the noise, general noise, environmental noise, and humans won't see anything unless they kind of study it from the outside as scientists. Well, from that alone, it follows there's got to be a genetic component. And if you go on to the next step, a couple of months later, it just becomes more obvious. They're doing very specific things that consistently, very uniform ways. Of course, it's driven by data, but so is everything. On the other hand, it's going on a path which is not determined by data. You can see that from the elementary fact that no other organism does it, plus that there's no way of doing it just from data if you look at it. And they get to the capacity that we're using very early, in fact. The better experimental work gets, the younger and younger are the capacities noted. In fact, there's even some work which is suggestive, and some of you guys know about it, that by around 2 years old, the child probably knows the whole language. Can't manifest it, but there's pretty good evidence that it can be elicited. That's the most interesting cases are the Helen Keller type case. She was 20 months old when she lost language capacity, to use at least, but she recovered it on the basis of almost no data, just touch. In fact, she invented the technique that's now used to teach deaf-blind. It's called Tadoma, where you sort of put your hand on someone's face and you get information from the vocal cords and the cheek. And on the basis of that, she got fantastic linguistic capacity, which is almost impossible unless you knew everything. Adding to this is something about which there aren't enough cases to draw a confident conclusion, but they seem systematic. If the loss was before about 18 months, there's never been a case of recovery. So it looks as if there's something going on right around then, which is basically giving the language. Then you sort of add details or refine it or something like that. Well, whatever this is, and it seems to be independent of other cognitive capacities. There's quite good evidence now for radical dissociations with other capacities. Well, these are kind of some of the, even if this detail isn't right, the general picture is, and it seems there's more and more evidence that it just has to be an internally directed process, from the most obvious to much more complex arguments than what I've given. So there's got to be a genetic component. There's a technical name for the generative component. It's called UG, okay? Universal grammar. That's taking over a traditional phrase for a new context. The existence of UG is hotly denied, overwhelmingly. Huge literature saying it's ridiculous. So what the literature is saying, everything's a miracle. That's exactly what it's saying, because there's no alternative. There's no coherent alternative. Now, there are proposals. So there are proposals about shared intentionality, culture. These are interesting proposals. I mean, they give hand-waving a bad name, actually. If you look at them, there's just nothing there, and there can't possibly be anything there, if only because of dissociations, or because of timing, like a 2-year-old doesn't know anything about the culture, and shared intentionality, like autistic kids don't have it, they speak fine. And it goes on and on, and furthermore, there's nothing that comes out of it, zero, but it's very widely held. You can read about it from, technical articles in the cognitive science journals to Times Literary Supplement and all across the board, except that it's totally vacuous and can't make any sense. Just, all you have to do is think about it. You see, it can't make any sense. Well, there are more specific proposals which are of some interest because you can investigate them at least. So one proposal is just monstrous memory, like you memorize everything. Well, again, it's infinite, so you're not going to be able to memorize everything. Furthermore, even if you take normal usage, which actually was studied by George Miller, who was here, late George Miller, 60 years ago, he looked at sentences of 8th grade reading level, Reader's Digest, and calculated how much you'd have to memorize if you could understand those sentences. It turns out more than the number of particles in the universe. You know? If you reduce it by replacing the words by categories, which is not a trivial matter, it's basically the same. The numbers are so big, it doesn't make any difference. If you put in phrases, which is often done, you've given the game away, because the phrases have to be recursively generated. So you're done, you know. Well, that's the memorization story. There are interesting, there's an industry of statistical models, which are quite interesting to look at. There's a kind of hysteria about the importance of statistics and, you know, sophisticated Bayesian, et cetera. There's a couple of phrases you have to use when you write about this. And it's not zero. I mean, if you look back, say, to the beginning, early 50s, there was an argument, actually I wrote about it back in the mid-50s, that you should be able to detect words from phrases, from continued, not phrases, from continued text, to isolate them just by looking at transition probabilities. That's mentioned in Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. Actually, it's mentioned as a footnote because it looked obvious. There doesn't seem to be any other evidence. Well, if that were true, you could do something with statistical models. Whether this has anything to do with language acquisition is a totally different story. I mean, kids don't learn words by picking them out of continuous discourse. You know, they know a lot before they're looking at the discourse. Anyhow, no point pursuing it. It turns out to be wrong. Charles showed that years ago. You can get something, but only if you add UG principles. And there's subsequent work by Shukla, Pierre Humbert, others, which shows you got to know quite a lot even to do this. That's one of the very few examples. There's another interesting one. Interesting ones in Charles's work. Again, one thing that he showed is there's been a lot of study in recent years, connectionist work and others, on trying to account for the learning of irregular verbs. It's kind of a peripheral problem. It was never studied very much, but recently it has been. None of it works except for Charles's proposal, which gives a very interesting answer to the question of how irregular verbs are learned by intermingling probabilistic arguments with UG principles. And as far as I know, everything in this field, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if it gets anywhere, it works that way. Or else it deals with different problems, like processing or communication and so on. Okay, everyone always agreed, sure, statistical models are significant there. But again, you can read there's plenty of literature, a lot of it very triumphalist in the technical journals, listing all kind of great results that have been achieved. Every one you look at, when you look at it and take it apart, it achieved absolutely nothing except a total irremediable failure. But it just goes on and on. This is kind of unstoppable, and so taking over a lot of cognitive science. Well, actually the only work that I know of, change me if it's wrong, is kind of around the margins as far as the nature of the system is concerned. It's the only question we're asking, and its acquisition, and maybe its use, and involves an intermingling of UG principles with probabilistic arguments. Charles's book is about how these interact. So I think the conclusion is about the same. It should be the same. Adopt the biolinguistic perspective. Study, the core topic is I-language, generative procedure, and you got to try to figure out what UG is. What is the genetic basis? Incidentally, there's a lot of literature pointing out, sort of saying, gosh, after 50 years, these guys have been studying the UG and they still don't know what it is. There must be something wrong. Try studying the genetic basis for having blue eyes, or let alone any complex trait. I mean, it's known. You just take a look at your favorite advanced text in biology, evolutionary biology. They point out, to quote, it's fiendishly difficult to find the genetic basis for almost anything. I mean, it's not that anyone denies that it exists, but organisms are complex creatures. To try to pull out the properties that are genetic and separate them from lots of interacting factors is no small trick, even when you have a hundreds of millions of dollars from the NSF for experimentation and so on and so forth. And to do it for a trait as complex as language, a cognitive trait, that's beyond fiendishly difficult. So if there are any results at all, and I think there are, it's amazing. It's an amazing achievement. And the fact that you haven't answered the question is about on the par with the common complaint that after all these years, no one's written a complete grammar of any language. I mean, it's not even worth talking about. You don't even know exactly what you're supposed to describe. So what's in it and what isn't in it and so on and so forth. These are impossible goals, never approached in the, never formulated in the sciences because they're so crazy. But it's somehow applied to this one field, which is supposed to be different from anything in the sciences. Well, the idea that you can have infinite output from a finite mechanism, that does go back to classical antiquity. So Euclidean geometry says more or less like that. But it's worth remembering that Euclidean geometry wasn't formalized until about a century ago. It was largely intuitive. And in fact, the general concepts, that's by Hilbert, the general concepts of what it means for a finite object to have an infinite yield, that wasn't really clarified till the 1930s and 40s. And by now it's understood, and by now everybody knows it. You all got a laptop computer, it's a stored program computer. The stored program, if it's the right program, generates an infinite output. Of course, it can only go up to a certain point unless you add memory, and that's often confused in the literature. When you add, say, arithmetic, you can have a program for multiplication, and it'll stop up to some big number. But the point is, if you add memory, it'll go on without changing the program. And that's the crucial part. The fact that, and the brain has got to be the same, and language has got to be the same. This crucial fact going on without changing the program, again, is greatly misunderstood even in the technical literature of computational cognitive science. That's why most of the connectionist models don't make any sense. If you add the next step, you got to change the whole program, So it's doing nothing, It's just showing that some finite output can be handled with what amounts to a list. Yeah, sure, but no interest. Well, these are things that ought to be understood. I mentioned that I language should be studied in the context of generative processes, recursive processes. It's part of recursive function theory, Turing machine theory, very narrow part of it. The concept of recursion is hopelessly misunderstood in the technical linguistic literature. For one thing, there's a debate about even whether it has to be infinite. No, it doesn't have to be infinite. You can have a recursive function with no output at all. In fact, those are some of the most interesting ones. But it doesn't have to be infinite, though in fact, in the case of human language, apparently it's always infinite. Recursion is constantly confused with embedding, or even self-embedding, which are special cases, but only special cases. And okay. We can go on if you don't mind being blind deaf. Actually, I just came back from Gaza, where this happens every hour or two. Okay, the generator kicked in. What? Somebody doesn't like us. Okay. There is another thing that's, if you look at actual language output, it seems there are very strange gaps in it. Actually, there's a classic study of this, which is very important and isn't read enough. Richard Kane, an article by one of your colleagues, Ken Hale, about 35 years ago on cultural gaps. It's very much worth reading, particularly because of a lot of complete nonsense that's flooding the field now about languages that allegedly don't have this or that. In fact, every case that's mentioned in the recent literature is discussed by Ken much more seriously, because he's a serious linguist, and gives good arguments showing how these apparent gaps are simply narrow restrictions on UG principles that the people all know. Then gives plenty of evidence from Australian languages, other languages. So that one's quite worth it. He also has some pretty interesting comments about the universal nature of relative clauses and embedded relative clauses, which are quite interesting, worth thinking about. Anyhow, that's these are things that ought to be known too. So whatever an I language is, it's something that gives it's a finite object, gives in the brain, gives an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which gets an interpretation at least, maybe at most, two other cognitive systems. One, it can be externalized somehow. So it doesn't have to be. In fact, most of our language use isn't externalized, but it can be externalized at the sensory motor system. We now know that that's modality independent, pretty much. Usually speech, but could be sign or touch or something else. It seems to be independent of modality. It also appears to vary a lot, and probably does vary a lot, which is an interesting fact. It's one of the many things that indicates, I think, that the externalization to the sensory motor system is probably some ancillary, secondary fact about language, kind of tacked onto it, not central. More central appears to be the fact that it interacts with what are roughly called thought systems. The technical term is conceptual intentional systems, intentional with a T. Not that the technical term adds anything particular except sounding fancy. But so there's got to be an externalization of that system, whatever it is. And there are very fundamental questions about which part of that mapping of the internal computation is part of the external system and which is part of the internal system. And that goes right to the heart of a lot of questions, like, say, anaphora. Where is it? You know, I mean, we usually assume it's internal to I language, but that's only because we have some ideas to how to deal with it. And so you can kind of, a lot of interesting work on how it works. But there's got to be plenty of computation in that outer system too, so who knows where the boundary is. And you get here into quite interesting questions about thought and language, which I won't talk about. Those are important topics. It's often argued that if any computational system that has roughly these properties is going to have embedded in it somewhere an operation that takes things that have already been generated and makes a bigger thing. It may not be put that way, like it may be a Freudian ancestral, or it could be a system of axioms or whatever, but somewhere embedded in it is that operation. There's no way to get around that. And notice that that's operations a lot of people, me and others, call merge. So there's got to be some operation merge that has that property. Well, merge automatically gives hierarchic structures, automatically. It's putting things together, so you get a structure, you add something else, you get a bigger structure. So it has the right properties. It's producing infinite number of hierarchic structures, which then have to get interpreted by processes that there's a lot of study of them at the, towards the sensory motor side, and some towards the conceptual intentional side, but a lot of it has the problem that I mentioned, which isn't investigated. Where is it? Is it inside the I language or outside the I language? Not easy to answer because we have independent evidence about the sensory motor system, like you can hear it, but almost nothing about the other systems. You're kind of wandering around a confused field there with a number of quite interesting questions. I won't go into them. It's often argued that there are simpler things than merge. The usual proposal is concatenation. Concatenation is a more complex notion. It presupposes merge, and furthermore, it presupposes ordering. It looks as if it's not hierarchical, But that's only because it has an extra operation, associativity, which knocks out the hierarchy. So it's more complex. There is a version, Norbert Hornstein's, which abstracts away from ordering, but still has to have the structure, the operation that strikes out structure. A lot of the study of formal linguistics, about all of it in fact, deals with weak generative capacity. You know, the weak generative capacity, say, of phrase structured grammars. That's considered to be simpler than the study of I language. It's much more complex because weak generative capacity is a derivative notion. You have to derive it from the I language by knocking out the structure. You take a look at a phrase structured grammar, it doesn't weakly generate. It strongly generates structures. You can wipe out the structure and look at what's left, which is already problematic because it's more complex. And it's doubly problematic because you don't know what's supposed to be in there. Every linguist knows that if you open a technical article in, say, linguistic inquiry, you're going to get expressions with stars and question marks and star question mark and all sorts of other things. And these are very interesting. A lot of the most important work has to do with these distinctions. So why is there a distinction between, say, subjacency and ECP violations? That's interesting. But it's all at the level of technically what wouldn't be generated by weak generative capacity. And this is not a new observation. This was discussed at length in the 1950s, a chapter of logical structure of linguistic theory devoted to it. Doesn't answer the question, but talks about some of the problems. So the study of weak generative capacity is, first of all, derivative, more complex, based on arbitrary stipulations. And it's not clear that it has anything to do with language. I mean, you know, I worked on it. I thought it was fun, but it's a small branch of formal logic or mathematics. Some vague relations to language, but not much. It's worth thinking through as well. Going back to what I still haven't started and what happened for the last 60 years, but the early proposals back in the 50s, I mean, as soon as it was realized that everything you look at is completely problematic, from the first phrase of the Bible to the next sentence you look at, the proposals started coming along as to how to deal with it. Well, the early proposals back, say, in the 50s were extremely complex. I won't review them, but if you look at say, my proposals, others, they assumed a lot of complex mechanisms, which seemed necessary. There didn't seem to be any other way just to describe the data in different languages. And I think the history of the field, at least at the theoretical level since then, has been an effort to try to simplify it, to remove the stipulations, the complexity, the mechanisms, and see if you can get to principles from which a lot of these things follow. There should be nothing problematic about this. That's what's called science. Science is the search for simple mechanisms that account for complex phenomena. Anything else is, flower collecting, so, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, but it's not science. So there's nothing problematic about it. I won't run through the steps, which you're all familiar, most of you at least are familiar with. But it's been a kind of steady progress in that. In recent years, work in this direction has been given another name, which was a mistake, I think, my mistake. It's been called the Minimalist program. And that led, anything you say about language, there's one thing you can be certain of. It's going to elicit enormous confusion and misunderstanding. That's a kind of a theorem, I don't know what it follows from, but it's a fact, And the Minimalist program is totally misunderstood. It's constantly described as a theory, and then there's arguments that the theory is falsified by this. It's not a theory, it's just science. It's trying to find the best explanation for complex phenomena. Eliminating stipulations where you can, eliminating complex mechanisms, showing how they can be derived by deeper principles, and in fact just deepening explanation. That's what inquiry is about. The minimalist program is just a seamless continuation of efforts that went on from the first notice that we don't understand anything. Well, it did, the program did suggest some new research programs, which, you know, the research programs it's not true or false. You know, either it's useful or it isn't useful. I think this one has been useful. The research program that it suggests is to start by assuming that a language is essentially perfect, that it in the most optimal fashion satisfies the interface conditions. Those of you who took courses of mine since about 1980 will remember that every course started by saying, okay, let's assume this, and then started looking at the facts and everything fell apart, so we didn't get anywhere. But around the 90s, the program started to make more sense. And my guess is it's going to turn out to be the right program. It's hard to show, but I think that's kind of a long-run goal that people might keep in mind, and I think there's reasons for it. What that means is try to formulate what's sometimes called a strong minimalist thesis. Not the strong minimalist thesis. We don't know enough to do that, but one that looks plausible. The one that says, here would be a perfect solution to the external conditions on I language. A couple of ideas about what that should be. And then raise two kinds of questions. One of the kinds of questions is descriptive. When you take a look at the data of a wide variety of languages from this starting point, you find a lot that doesn't work. So the first, almost automatically. So the first descriptive problem is see if you can show that what doesn't seem to work is based on misanalysis of the data or misformulation of the principles. And if you can do that, okay, you've advanced the program. And I think there's been a lot of work going in that direction. Nowhere near the end, but quite a lot. The other question you can ask is kind of more abstract, and that is, assuming that something like your strong minimalist thesis is correct, what does that tell you about the nature of language, the architecture of language, or maybe of cognition generally? And actually, I think it tells you quite a lot, which more than is generally appreciated. Well, as I said, let's just proceed, assume that this is the right way to approach things. I mentioned that any strong minimalist thesis, in fact, any approach to language, is going to have to assume a merge-like operation. So the question is what it is. Well, of course, if just proceeding in the normal manner of science, that is, following the minimalist program, which is all it is, at least you'll start by assuming that the operation's as simple as possible. Okay, if it goes wrong, you complicate it. As simple as possible means that when you merge, say, two things, X and Y, then neither of them will change. So you're minimizing, the overriding principle that one ought to try to keep to is a sort of minimal computation. Try to show that the system has at least the least messy it has to be. So minimal computation. I don't think that's a UG principle. I think it's what I've sometimes called a third factor principle. It's an overriding principle that works for the sciences altogether. Maybe it's a law of nature or something, or a law of human cognition, whatever you think it is. But it determines what counts as rational inquiry. So look for minimal communication, computation. That means you're not going to, that the merge XY is not going to change either X or Y. That's called the no tampering condition, but it's just minimal computation, which has interesting consequences, very interesting consequences. The other condition it ought to meet is that it's unordered. That's simpler than being ordered. So the least computation will take X and Y and not change them and leave them unordered, which means it just forms the set XY. That's what it amounts to. That would be the perfect answer. Okay, here we get into a real morass, because where does ordering come from? I mean, it's all over the place, and a lot of complicated issues related to it. One thing that shouldn't strike you right away is that ordering and other arrangements, in fact, are required at the sensory motor system. Like, we can't talk unordered sets, hierarchically structured unordered sets. So something's going on, at least in the externalization, that's imposing order and, in fact, other arrangements. Like in sign, there's more than order, and even in speech, prosody and so on, but at least order. So maybe it's a reflex of linearization, of externalization, one possibility. If that's true, it shouldn't, just by the general architecture of the system, it shouldn't enter into narrow syntax and semantic interpretation, the mapping to the CI interface. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence that that may be true. These interpretations typically seem to involve hierarchy, not order. They work the same with different orders. That suggests, that collection of observations suggests that maybe ordering is just an artifact, non-linguistic artifact, connected with the fact that this system has to get to the sensory motor system. Well, if you take a look at the evolutionary, as I mentioned, the study of evolution of language is such a morass that I don't even want to get into it. I have never seen so much confusion on any topic, literally. Actually, it begins from the name of the topic. One of the problems with the study, there's a huge library, growing library on evolution of language, and one pretty obvious problem with it is the topic doesn't exist. Languages don't evolve. Evolution is something that happens to organisms. Languages don't have genes, they don't evolve. Languages change, but that's not evolution. And if you look at the literature, it's actually studying change. And it's not even studying change of language. It's studying change of communication practices. And it's not even studying that because it's all hogwash. It's just concocting stories. Maybe it happened this way, maybe it happened that way. Well, there is a field of historical linguistics, a serious field, but you can't get away with it in that field by saying maybe this happened or maybe that happened, but that's almost the whole field of what's called evolution of language. However, there are few things to say about it, very few. I actually know of only two things that can be said about it. One is that there's been, it's of course evolution of the language capacity. It's an evolution of humans, language users. And one thing we can be quite confident about is that nothing has happened for at least 50,000 years, whatever the date is from when humans began leaving Africa. Small number of humans started drifting out of East Africa, roughly 50, maybe 75,000 years ago. There's archaeological evidence about this. And since that time, nothing's happened. And you can be pretty sure of that just from the fact that infants today are equally capable of acquiring any language without any difficulty. So they've all got the same language capacity. I mean, there are individual differences, but I don't think there are any group differences known. Not everything's been studied, of course, but the evidence on this is pretty overwhelming. So there's strong evidence that either nothing or nothing of any significance has happened for maybe 50, 75,000 years. The second piece of evidence, which is less certain, but reasonable at least, is that if you go back another, say, 50 or 75,000 years, there's no evidence, archaeological, paleontological evidence, there was anything like language. Okay? You don't get the artifacts, the complex symbolic representations. It all seems to have come along pretty suddenly, sometimes called a great leap forward by paleoanthropologists, roughly in that window. Well, that's an extremely narrow window from an evolutionary point of view. It's a flick of the eye. So what appears to have happened is that something changed suddenly which yielded this capacity. And notice that there were no selectional effects at that time. Things that change happen to an individual, like a group doesn't undergo a rewiring of the brain or genetic alteration or something. An individual does. And that individual is under no selectional pressures, zero. I mean, the capacity could proliferate through a small breeding group, which is what our ancestors were. And maybe after a while, a lot of people have it. And at that point, it would make some sense to figure out a way to make it public. It's all going on in the head. That's externalization. Externalization is a tough problem. It's a tough cognitive problem. You have to match whatever's in the brain, which got there somehow, probably like, some small rewiring. You've got to match that with a sensory motor system, which had been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And for that, there's good fossil evidence. So there's a sensory, and maybe as far back as chimpanzees, 12 million years ago, but 6 million years ago. But you've got to match these two different systems, which have nothing to do with each other. And that's a pretty complex process, which can be done in a lot of different ways. There'll be a lot of ways of mapping something that sort of satisfies the strong minimalist thesis to a system that has absolutely nothing to do with it. And in fact, we just know, the overwhelming complexity of what we observe in language, overwhelmingly the complexities in the externalization. Of course, maybe we just don't know other things about what's internal, but the vast complexity looks like it's in the externalization. Also the diversity. I mean, that's where languages seem very diverse on the surface. But the more you look, you find they're much less diverse at the computational level, the I-language level, and they're also very easily subject to change at the externalization level. I mean, it's happening every generation, teenage jargon and so on. Norman invasion changes the externalization massively. And it's the whole history of language, not evolution, but change. So it looks as though, just from data like these, that the externalization aspect of language is some ancillary phenomenon. It's kind of tacked on after something developed which had no selectional pressures. So therefore it would have been optimal. It would have been something like a snowflake. It just happens by laws of nature. Well, that's the strong minimalist thesis, that there ought to be a snowflake in there which is mapped onto the sensory motor system by a lot of different complex ways, which can be rediscovered and changed and be modified and so on, but it may not even be part of I-language in the kind of a narrow sense. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's questions about it, but anyhow, it's kind of ancillary. Now, much more interestingly, there's internal linguistic evidence that leads to the same conclusion, and that's much more interesting, because these are all speculations based on the 2 or 3 facts we know about language evolution. The internal evidence is much more significant, and that comes right away as soon as you look at the most elementary combinatorial operation, merge. So go back to merge. It's kind of null hypothesis is it doesn't change the things that are merged, and it doesn't impose order. Okay. Just take the first of those. Doesn't change the things that's merged. Well, just by the logic of the situation, nothing else. If you look at merge of x, y, it has 2 possibilities, exactly 2. One of them is called external merge, the other is called internal merge. And by just logic, nothing to debate, those 2 are available and they have a definite output. External merge is essentially what puts things together and leaves them as a unit. So you take whatever underlies the man and whatever underlies is tall, and you put them together, you get something that underlies the man is tall. Okay, external merge. Internal merge, which is the only other possibility, takes some unit, let's say, read the book, and takes something that's inside that unit and merges it to it. So the book read the book, or what the man saw what, Okay, that's internal merge. Now notice that that has two properties. For one thing, it yields displacement. Displacement's a ubiquitous property of language. You see it all over the place. The other is it yields the copy theory. They both remain, okay? That's the null hypothesis. There's a lot of confused literature about the copy theory, assuming it involves other operations, copy, remerge, and so on. No, nothing. It's just the most elementary case of merge. If it doesn't occur in some language, you got to explain why. So you need some stipulation to block it, okay, because it's just free. Now that's important for a number of reasons. For one thing, those of you who know the literature will know about this, and those of you who work on it, that the copy theory has extremely important consequences at the CI level, conceptual intentional level. It yields most of the basic reconstruction effects automatically. Now that's quite significant. These are very complex semantic effects. I won't go into them, you know about them. They're very complex semantic judgments, and it's extremely mysterious where they come from. A child has no evidence for them, zero, but everybody knows them, and they know them in a very specific way. So it's got to follow that they just come from some elementary mechanisms that's there anyhow, and it yields these results. Now, it doesn't yield all of them, and that suggests a research topic. Show that it yields all of them, because it ought to. And if it seems that it's not yielding all of them, there's something we don't understand about reconstruction processes. And you should, important topic of inquiry is fill in the gap. Show that, in fact, if we understood everything, yeah, it would yield all of them. It's close enough to make that plausible. And it's conceptually natural, because it ought to, The second fact about it, I'm sorry. The second important fact about it is that it produces the major complications in parsing communication. Those of you who've worked on parsing programs are aware that the toughest problem is what are called filler gap problems. Okay, so you hear a sentence with a WH phrase at the beginning, and you got to figure out where it comes from. Well, why does that happen? Well, let's go back to the principle of minimal computation, as least computation as possible. What that's going to do is give you the copy theory internally, and it's going to wipe out all copies except at least one, because every one, you have to have at least one or you don't know anything's happened. But it has to wipe out all the others, because each other copy, and there can be many copies, it's not as simple as what did John see. You look at more complicated sentences, copies all over the place. It has to wipe, each one of those copies is complicated to compute and to articulate, and they can be of arbitrary complexity. Remember, each of these phrases can be of arbitrary complexity. So if you pronounced all the copies, it would overcome almost all of the filler gap problems, but it's a lot of extensive computation. So what you have is a conflict between computational efficiency and communicative efficiency. It's one of many such conflicts. And in every case I know, correct me if I'm wrong, computational efficiency wins hands down. There's never even any competition. Everything works by computational efficiency. It doesn't give a damn what the effects are for communicative efficiency. And that shows up all over the place. I mean, take just structurally ambiguous sentences. Flying planes can be dangerous. They come about if the rules just apply with nobody fiddling with them. But they cause communicative problems. Or what are they called? Garden path sentences, another example. Or probably islands. I mean, islands are basically things that you can think, but you can't say, You have to find some paraphrase. And to the extent, it's an interesting topic, trying to understand them, but to the extent that they're understood, which is limited, they seem to follow by making optimal rules. And there's another gap, try to show that it's always the case. If it's always the case as it should be, then there'll be another case at that point. Well, another example, which is interesting because of its history and its consequences, and because it's been very intensively studied, is structure dependence. Now, that was noticed as a puzzle back in the 50s. It was never regarded as a puzzle in the preceding several thousand years of intensive language study. But if you take a sentence like instinctively eagles that fly swim, very simple sentence. Instinctively goes with swim. It doesn't go with fly. Okay, no one ever makes a mistake about that. The children never make mistakes about it. A lot of the discussion of this has been confused by the fact that the examples that are looked at involve displacement. It's irrelevant, and so people have all kind of complicated theories about displacement, but it doesn't matter. You have exactly the same phenomenon with no displacement. And it's, furthermore, every construction the fact of it is that there's a simple computation, linear computation, the simplest possible, which would get instinctively to link up with fly. Instinctively, eagles that fly swim. It's the closest. Just count, okay? So it's the closest, easiest computation you can get, never used. The actual computation is much more complex. It involves structure. It involves minimal structural distance, which is a much harder computation, and that's done in these constructions. In fact, it's done in every construction, in every language that has any of these properties. So there's got to be some reason for it. And a very simple reason would be that there's no linear order. That at the point where all this stuff is being computed internally, there's no linear order, so therefore you have to use the next most complicated minimal distance measure, structural distance. Now that would yield a whole mass of results in all kind of languages, no exception known. But of course it requires assuming that the merge operation is unordered. That is, that we have something like a strong minimalist thesis. Now, this one is kind of interesting because just modern history, there's a small industry in computational cognitive science. It's even gotten into the linguistic literature, whole issues of linguistic journals devoted to pointless proposals about this, as you guys know, trying to show that you can get it somehow, some other way. You know, statistical analysis, a couple of examples in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, all kind of crazy proposals are given. They're interesting because they can be investigated. They're clear enough to be investigated. So you can easily demonstrate that everyone is not only a failure, but an irremediable failure. There's no way to get out of it, you know. And yet they keep coming because it's just not permitted that there be a linguistic principle of UG, in fact, that would account for a huge complex mass of phenomena. A kind of interesting pathology in the field. You can try to explain it. But there's a very interesting principle, simple one. It's rooted in, has a conceptually natural base, and it does suggest that order is just a reflex of the sensory motor system. Well, prima facie, that doesn't look possible. It conflicts with a lot of important linguistic work, prima facie. So what we want to ask is, does it really conflict? I think the most striking conflict perhaps is with the work on what's called cartography, you know, Cinque, Ricci, others. So say take Cinque's, what he calls universal base hypothesis, you know, mood, tense, verb, object, that kind of thing. And plus a lot of refinement, you know, extensive refinement of these categories with dozens of postulated functional categories in his system which are ordered in a particular way. Well, this seems to conflict with it because that all enters into semantic interpretation. However, these studies, which are extremely interesting, and the empirical work is very impressive, I think, but it just can't be right, you know. There's no way in which anyone could possibly learn that functional structure. I mean, it's inconceivable. There's no evidence for it, you know. And though it could develop through an evolutionary process, it's pretty hard to imagine how. I mean, why should evolution ever give this crazy thing? Why not reordering them somehow? So the natural assumption, and I think Cinque kind of agrees with this, we've talked about it a lot, is that, and Luigi Rizzi also, that there ought to be some semantic or pragmatic reasons why they come out this way and not some other way. You know? And there's some work, a couple of dissertations, some other work trying to work it out. Well, there's a good reason to expect that that's where it's going to go if we learn enough. So another gap to look at. But if it does, then this work, while, you know, I'm not questioning its significance, I think it's very significant, it probably won't have to do with language, language. If you can reduce some observed phenomenon to a pragmatic consideration, let's say, like it wouldn't be useful to do it the other way, there's an extraneous source, you know, outside the language system. And of course, there's plenty of interaction of all kinds of things. So I think that's a direction to look, an important direction to look. Anyhow, what all of this seems to me to suggest is that we abandon a contemporary dogma, and I stress contemporary, very modern dogma, that the core of language is communication. That's the last 50 years. If you go back before that, the traditional view was that language is an expression of thought. I mean, that goes all the way back. You get it in linguists like William Dwight Whitney, Descartes, Galileo, you know, Aristotle, everybody. Language is supposed to be an expression of thought. Today, it is literally a dogma that it has to be based on communication. Like in the philosophical literature, there are articles by good people saying, who can't understand how I can even question this, since it's kind of it's like the nose on your face. It's got to be true. Well, there's strong evidence that it isn't true, of the kind that I mentioned, but that doesn't matter. It's got to be true. Why? Well, interesting question, but my suspicion is that it's a consequence of the behavioral science dogmas of 50 years ago, which covered the whole field, you know, the whole range of fields, linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and so on. You had to believe in them. And if you believe that, then it's natural to think that communication would somehow be the core of language. I suspect it's also based on total misunderstanding of evolutionary biology, which is very common among the people who talk about it. Not evolutionary biologists, but anyone who alludes to it. That's the belief that there is a phrase in Darwin, it's there, which crucially there, you know, right in front, which says, evolution has to be the result of small changes. You know, well, accumulation of a lot of small changes that gives you different organisms. His book, of course, is called Origin of Species, but you notice there's nothing about species in it, because even today it's extremely unclear how species develop. But the evidence, by now it's quite well known that no one's questioning Darwin's insights. Yeah, of course, natural selection is significant, but it's very well known that that's just not true. There's case after case of dramatic change, probably involving species appearance, which is sudden from an evolutionary point of view. So, for example, classic example, which is not certain, but it's widely assumed by evolutionary biologists, is the change from invertebrates to primitive vertebrates, chordates. It seems to have come from a tiny change, which all of a sudden changed the whole body plan and everything else. And there's plenty of other cases. So there's just no reason to believe it. You know, it's not in accord with evolutionary biology. It's a doctrine. You learn it in 8th grade and so on, but you know, put it out of your head. If you believe it, then it makes sense to trace language back to communication, because you get communication, you know, all the way back to bacteria. So every organism has some way of communicating, interacting with the environment or each other, and you can make up a story, or 1,000 stories, they're all each is as good as the other, about how maybe small changes in communicative practice led to language. You can't make up any story about how language developed by small changes, because that's a sudden change. It's a new principle, new phenomenon. Had to be a kind of rewiring of the brain, maybe a small genetic change. Nobody knows enough to say. But it's very hard to even imagine a plausible alternative. But apart from general plausibility, there's very strong evidence, most of it internal linguistic evidence. So therefore, nobody looks at it. Because one of the principles of cognitive science these days is you're not supposed to know anything. It's kind of crucial not to know anything. Literally, like my own university, if a student in the cognitive science department has a thesis on, or an article on language, which involves knowing something about language, it's almost automatically thrown out. And that covers a lot of the field. And I think there's an origin for that too. It comes back to the early days of artificial intelligence. It's deeply rooted in the computational cognitive sciences. You're not supposed to understand anything, because the principle is if you have huge mass of data and you throw a big computer at it and you have a lot of statistics, something's supposed to come out. Well, chances of that happening are approximately zero, and if you look at 60 years of it, I think the results conform to the expectations. But if you adopt that way of looking at things, and if you're you got in the back of your mind the whole behavioral science framework, these conclusions come out pretty naturally. But I think it's kind of important for people in the field. You know, this field, our field, at least what I take to be my field, is not going to survive unless the surrounding intellectual environment can see why there's a point in carrying it out. And to a very large extent, that's not the case, and it's diminishing, which is a problem for those of you who are not my age, which you ought to think about. Not a problem for me, I won't be around. But, well, there are, how are we doing on time?
About 35 minutes.
35 minutes?
Yeah.
We have, okay.
Questions?
Well, I'll stop then.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff I want to get into, but why don't I stop and leave it open to you? Actually, you should have been interrupting all along, since you're too polite. You know, I can go on sort of indefinitely, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Ken.
From the logic that you lay out here about, say, copy theory being simply result of no tampering, would you have to say that the interpretation of these kinds of structures would have to be something that is a third factor kind of thing? So, for example, if you say, you know, what did John see, you're getting what did John see what, but that's not what you're interpreting, right? So,
I think it is when you're interpreting.
well, then what is it?
Well, it's a very straightforward interpretation. What did John see what? You can write it out in classical logic. I don't say that's the way it's done, but it's easy. For which X, a thing, John saw the thing X. That's what you want to interpret.
But that's not what the copy theory gives you.
No, but that's a way of annotating. See, as far as the brain's concerning, it may just look at what did you see what. Okay, we can write out what it's doing in a way intelligible to us because we studied elementary logic, in which we express it as for which thing X, John saw the thing X. But there's no reason to believe that's what's going on in here. It may be just looking at what John saw what and interpreting it that way.
Well, I don't know. There certainly are theories out there of what it is that has to be interpreted on the basis of that input. So like Danny Fox is a particular theory of...
These are all, notice there's a lot of ways of saying it, but they're all saying the same thing. They're saying we get this thing, what John saw what, and we're asking what's a natural way of putting it in terms that we understand. Now, I don't say that these are just arbitrary choices, like the different choices, say Danny Fox's and someone else, sometimes have empirical differences, but not often if you look. They're usually intertranslatable. So you can do it with,
I think there are differences.
Pardon?
I think there are differences in how...
Yeah, if there are differences, fine, then you look at them and that gives you more insight into exactly how it's being interpreted. But notice that what we're looking at the rules that are called formal semantics, okay? These are generally understood to be operations that take the narrow syntactic objects, like what did you see what, and turn it into something interpretable at CI. Okay, but then we're back to the question I asked before. Let's say there are differences among the different approaches. I don't think it's all that obvious, but let's say there are. Then there's a right answer and a wrong answer. Okay, there's a right mechanism and a wrong one. Where is that mechanism? Is it in the I language or is it in the thought system? Well, we don't know. But okay, so there's some mechanism, be interesting to find it, and then we'd have to explain it.
But if you take that, I'll stop after this, but if you take that view, then you're also attributing a lot to the thought system.
Not attributing it, just say we don't know. I mean, it doesn't, there's no more complexity assuming it's attributing to one than the other. I mean, first thing you have to show is that there are empirically significant differences between different ways of interpreting what the narrow syntax gives you. It's not a simple task, as you know, but suppose you can. If you can, then you have an argument for one mechanism over another mechanism. Next question, where's that mechanism in the whole architecture of cognition? Third question, why is it there? Well, maybe the reason why it's there is some third factor principle that we don't know. But since we don't have a theory of computation that holds for thought systems or semantic interpretation, you can't talk about third factor principles. This is very much like narrow syntax in the 1950s. You postulate whatever mechanism you need, T markers or whatever it may be, to give you some phenomenon. And that just can't be right, for the same reason it wasn't right in narrow syntax. So you have to ask, okay, why is it this way, not some other way? In other words, you have to pursue the minimalist program. You have to, and that, I'm not criticizing it, but it hasn't even been undertaken in these domains. All the work, maybe rightly, is devoted to how to get mechanisms which will give you the descriptively accurate results, okay? And that's fine. I don't mean to be critical, like I wasn't critical of the work in the 50s in narrow syntax, but it's just the beginning, You got to go on and answer all these other questions. It's kind of like cartography. I think extremely interesting work, raises all kinds of questions. Okay, go on to pursue the questions. And I think these are the questions that arise in this case, for all of formal semantics. Notice that formal semantics is not semantics. It's misnamed. It's syntax. Formal semantics is symbol manipulation. And by definition, that's syntax. The classical notions of syntax, semantics, pragmatics are symbol manipulation is syntax, and then our question where it's going on. And semantics has to do with relations to some outside world, okay? And it's very possible, in fact, in my view, correct probably, that language just doesn't have a semantics. I mean, we talk about the outside world, but that's referring or talking about. Those are actions. From the fact that we refer to things, which we certainly do, it doesn't mean that there's a reference relation in language. And I think there's strong evidence that there isn't. there is in animal communication, as far as we know. So it looks as though in animal communication, one of the many respects in which animal communication systems look totally different from human language, in almost every respect. But one of them is, actually Randy Gallistel's worked on this among others, that it seems to be the case in animal communication systems that every symbol has a one-to-one relation to some externally identifiable physical phenomenon. So, you know, the leaves flutter and the vervet monkey emits what we call a warning call, or some hormonal change and elicits what we call "I'm hungry," you know. And that looks, first of all, it looks reflexive, like they got to do it. And it also seems to have a denotational property. You know, there's a mind-independent characterization of some event in the world that's one-to-one related to the internal symbol. The human words are not like that at all. There's a denotational dogma that claims that words, nouns refer to things, and, you know, verbs to events, and so on. As soon as you look at the words, they don't do that at all. I mean, any word that's ever been looked at doesn't work like that. It's perfectly true that we refer to things, but not that way. It looks like part of the theory of action. And if that's correct, language doesn't even want to have a semantics. It'll have an internal syntax and a pragmatic. I'm not saying you can prove this, but at least my view is that's what the evidence points to. But in the work that you're talking about, which is quite fascinating, you know, no denigration, is syntactic work by definition. That's true, incidentally, of all of model theoretic semantics. Model theoretic semantics, for those of you who work on it, postulates individuals and studies arrangements of the individuals, you know, predicates over the individuals and so on. But the individuals are mental objects. They're not things in the world. They're anything you postulate to make the mechanisms work. And you somehow have to relate all this stuff to the world. Well, at that point, you're getting into semantics, but nobody looks at that. And in fact, if you do look at it, I don't think there's any way to do it. It's not that the models are wrong, it's just that to find a way of showing how they enter into the acts of referring is going to be a tricky thing. It's not just you see a cow and you say cow. No, that doesn't work at all.
What's the difference between an algorithm and a generative process?
Well, you can take, say, Marr again. A generative process can be studied at any of his three levels. Actually, let's take an input-output. So general processes are different. But take what he's talking about, say vision. So you can study vision, which was his topic, at all three levels. You can say at the computational level, the problem of vision is, take a real case. You have 3 dots on a tachistoscopic image, and you have a series of these 3 dots. Okay, that's the external part. The internal part is you see a rigid object in motion. A pretty crazy thing, but it's true. It's called the rigidity principle. So the computational problem is just what I said. You get a series of 3 dots on a tachistoscope, you see a rigid object in motion. That's the computational part. Then comes the algorithmic part. Figure out the right mechanism, the right procedure that'll map one into the other. Okay, then, and you got to get the right one, because it could be others. The next step would be what's going on in the visual cortex that implements this algorithm. So you got all 3. When you look at a generative process, you only have 2. There's an internal process, maybe the kind I described, maybe something else, which is yielding these structures. It's not forming them. I mean, that's kind of like, say if you're studying mathematics, you think of a function. I mean, the way you kind of intuitively think about it is the function is taking this and it's yielding that. But a function is just a relation. It's not doing anything, you know. It's just saying, here's a relation, you know. That's a kind of intuitive way of thinking about it, but Or take a proof. You study, let's say, logic, and you learn what a proof is. You take the axioms, apply the rules of inference, and ultimately you get the theorem. That's nothing to do with proofs. I mean, that defines a proof is a geometrical object. It's a certain geometrical object. And the axiom system determines the infinite set of those geometrical objects. But proving a theorem is nothing like that. I mean, the way you prove a theorem is you got something you think may be true, you know, try to figure out a lemma, maybe it follows from this, and see if you can establish the lemma, and then do some other crazy thing, you know, get a flash of insight, whatever it may be. That's proving a theorem, but a proof itself, though it's described as if it's an action, isn't. It just as a function isn't an action. Or a rule of multiplication is not an action. It's just saying here's the triples such that x equals y times z, you know, just listing them. And that's what a generative process is. So there aren't any algorithms. There's a computational account. You can say, here's what it's doing. Somewhere, which we don't know, there's some mechanisms that are going on, but there's no middle level. That's why the applications of Dave Marr's very interesting and valuable approach just don't work for generative processes.
The hysteria aside, do you think there's a role that statistical models built from observational communications data like the newspaper, that there's a role for those kinds of models?
Sure.
in
Like,
understanding
give you a personal anecdote, if you don't mind. When I got my degree, PhD, which was a total fraud, incidentally. I hadn't done any work or anything else. And I won't go into why it happened, but I had no professional qualifications at all. And that's why I went to MIT, because they didn't care. But, and they didn't care because they were getting a ton of Pentagon money poured in to do research and do whatever you like. But that's how a lot of us got by. But I was talked to the director of the lab, and he listened. He was interested. He was a scientist, you know. I told him what I was working on. It sounded kind of interesting. So he asked me if I wanted to work on a machine translation project that they had. And I said, that's a stupid project. I'm not going to work on it. But if you want to hire me under the project, that's fine. And then I'll do the work that I'm talking about. He thought that was a pretty good answer. So I got the job, luckily. But I don't suggest that as an approach. But it worked in this case. The reason why it was a stupid project is linguistics is nowhere near enough to give a principled answer to how you might do something like that. So if you want to get it done, do it by brute force. You know, take Canada, well, what they actually do by now after having given up on the linguistics properly, take the Canadian Hansard, you know, parliamentary records. They're in French and English, parallel. So do a ton of totally boring and irrelevant statistical analysis, and you can kind of get an approximation to which French phrases and which English phrases more or less go together. That's how the Google translation programs work. They just match up a lot of garbage and do some techniques that don't give any insight. And it's like building a bigger bulldozer. There's nothing wrong with big bulldozers, but you don't study physics that way. So sure, it's fine. There's a lot of things you can do that way. In fact, almost anything in areas that you don't understand are done that way. I mean, almost all of engineering was done that way up until a generation ago. Like when I got to MIT, you know, main engineering school in the world, there were very good math and physics departments, but they were service departments. They were just teaching engineers tricks. And if you wanted to build something, you would go to MIT. You learn how to construct an electric circuit or build a bridge or something. Okay, you go to MIT. It's mostly brute force and you know, lore, things that people have learned by practice. The physics and math kind of help out to sort of formulate things. Within 10 years, it had totally changed. By the 1960s, when you guys were there, or later, it was a science university. Anyone who, no matter what engineering profession you're interested in, you study the same basic science. And then maybe some applications to different areas. And the reasons are simple. For the first time, science really had a lot to tell engineering. And furthermore, technology started changing very fast. So there wasn't any point learning how to design an electric circuit if 10 years later it's all going to be done on a computer, you know, and the same with every other field. So and it's very recent, notice. It's very recent that science had much to tell engineering. Same with medicine. I mean, until practically the last generation. In fact, there's a famous line in the history of medicine that I forget what year, maybe 1920, was a critical year in the history of medicine, because it's the first time when, if there was a confrontation between a patient and a doctor, the patient might improve from it. And the reason primarily was chemistry and engineering. So you get drugs that really cure things, and you know, people can fix your broken bones and stuff like that. But almost all medicine is still just lore. Now, good doctors or nurses and others kind of know from experience, intuition, wherever it's coming from, that this is a way to deal with this problem, sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But science is finally contributing something. And, you know, linguistics is nowhere near physics and biology. I mean, we don't understand the most elementary things. And machine translation is much more complex than curing pneumonia or something. So there's a huge gap. And in that gap, these statistical models are fine. They're brute force methods, don't yield any insight or understanding, except in the way that Charles does it when you integrate it with UG principles, which gives you something, you know. And I think that makes sense. There shouldn't be any conflict about it. But a lot of people are pretty hysterical about it. I don't know if you read Peter Norvik's diatribe, the guy who runs Google, and went crazy about it. And he gave a lot of examples, which are right. Those are examples of brute force in areas where you don't understand anything. And so, yeah, you go by brute force because you don't understand.
Yeah, no, I was asking about the other way, whether statistical models can help answer deep questions about language, and it sounds like this works.
Well, you know a lot more about it than I do, but I'd be interested in seeing what you think. But my feeling is that statistical models alone have a record of zero success. Is that an exaggeration? Yeah. At least I don't know the case. And nor do I expect them to. Why should they? I mean, they've got to be based on something. You know, you don't, if you're doing Bayesian models, you start with priors. Where do they come from? You know, if you look at the literature on it, say, famous, you know, very well-known study by a colleague of mine, Joshua Tenenbaum, came out in Science on how to grow a mind or something. You know that paper. He starts by postulating the priors and the priors are kind of a network of concepts which answers all possible questions before you start, except that the concepts are all wrong. And then he does a lot of complex statistical analysis and ends up saying, well, there isn't much to say about this. That's considered a major contribution. If you think that's a caricature, read the paper. But a lot of the stuff in the field is like that, and it's what you expect. I mean, if you say you wouldn't study physics by taking a ton of videotapes of what's happening outside the window and doing complex statistical analysis of it. I mean, you might get a pretty good prediction about what's likely to be outside the window tomorrow. In fact, way better than the physics department can give you. But it's not physics. Actually, one of the best ways of predicting the weather in Boston, I learned years ago, is to read the Cleveland newspapers. Because we usually get their weather the next day. Okay, that kind of works. Probably as good as meteorology. But it's different. Yeah.
So I'm interested in this idea about, first there was this brain event or something that led to language use in thought, but not in communication. And furthermore, it's when it got to communication that, that's the thing I'm wondering. Is that when you got ordering? Did you get ordering in thought before that?
We don't know whether there's ordering in thought, because the only introspection we have is into internal, externalized language. So if you just introspect, you can't go a minute without talking to yourself. But you're talking to yourself in externalized language. What's going on inside? Well, that's not accessible to consciousness. But if you introspect about the process, there hasn't been much work about that, so let's talk my personal introspections. My impression is that when I try to say something, even to myself, something is there first. I mean, I know what I mean, and I try to say it, and it doesn't come out right. And you try something else, and maybe that gets closer. And sometimes you find you just can't express it. You know, you can't find a way to express it that captures what you're thinking. That kind of experience, and there's a lot, actually there's some experimental work that's like it, that really bears on it, seems to indicate that probably everything of any significance is going on beyond consciousness. The experimental work has to do with choice, the Libet experiments, which I think have been badly misinterpreted. But there are some experiments that show that if I intend to pick up a cup, say, milliseconds before I intend, there's something going on in the motor organization system. Okay, that's been argued to show you don't have free will. No, it doesn't show anything. It just shows that it's all the decisions are all going on unconsciously. And by the time they reach consciousness, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, this kind of peripheral phenomenon, it's all done. And that's probably true of everything. Now, studying unconscious thought is no trivial matter. I mean, it's not impossible. So, for example, there have been studies of somebody will know the details of people who are just thinking about things to say. It turns out you can detect a very slight lip movements and things like that. Now, I've asked some people who work on sign, and some people are looking at it to see if when people are thinking in, first of all, nobody knows how people are thinking in sign. It just hasn't been investigated. Like take a native speaker of sign language. I mean, they're obviously thinking all the time, just like we are. Are they thinking in sign? Well, if they are, what's it like? And can you detect hand movements, minimal hand movements? Well, you know, you could pursue inquiries like this, which give you something, but they're not going to go very far, because what's going on beyond the level of consciousness is probably almost everything significant. Consciousness is some kind of peripheral thing which picks up some of what's going on in our head. It's not a small problem, you know, but we shouldn't pretend it's not there because we don't understand anything.
So we think in language, but
We don't know. We don't know.
We don't know what
We don't know that we're thinking in language, which comes to consciousness. First of all, at least me, when I introspect into my use of language, it isn't sentences. It's scattered phrases. You know, bits and pieces of phrases. I mean, I can restate them as a sentence, but when I really think about it, I'm getting, you know, a word here, another word there, or somehow it's all the listening, something that's really back there somewhere, and you put it together. Try it sometime. It's kind of interesting to introspect into what you're doing when you're just talking to yourself. We're not talking to ourselves in something you'd write, or even something you'd speak. And it gives the impression, at least to me, as if something going on in there, bits and pieces come out occasionally, and we kind of construct them and try to put them in a intelligible form. And when you speak or when you write, it's another step to trying to do it. But you know, this is just guesses. Nobody's really studied it. Yeah.
I wanted to get back to your first principles, and I think you might be hard-pressed to find people who wouldn't agree that there's something that's special about humans that gives us the capacity for language. There have to be some kind of biases that help in statistical learning.
Well, I'll give you some names if you want. Michael Tomasello, for example.
No, he does.
Look, what he says is shared intentionality. He doesn't say anything about principles of computation.
Right, so that's what I wanted you about. I wanted to ask you about.
And shared
what
intentionality is
clear-
totally irrelevant. Totally.
Well,
Because
it
people
correlates
without,
very well with,
what?
in autistic children, it correlates very well with their ultimate attainment in language, their abilities and joint attention.
no, that's different. That's use of language. But you can have an autistic child, I in fact know some, who have no idea what anybody else wants and can't deal with anyone else, but whose language is perfect. And in fact, if you look at just the acquisition rate, you know, acquisition of language is very early. Acquisition of what's called theory of mind or something, shared intentionality, that's considerably later.
Is that based on Ouija board kind of?
Yeah, and any kind of experimentation that's done. I mean, it's, 3 or 4-year-olds that are picking up the ability to do this theory of mind experiments. But there's a much more serious problem. Even if we believe it exists, suppose it's based on shared intentionality, as he claims. How do you go from shared intentionality to structure dependence? You know, or anything.
Well, there's also categorization and grouping.
Yeah, but categorization is a different thing. That's a thought process. That's not language. I mean, if it shows up in
Right,
language.
so this is what I wanted to ask you about. You had said there were clear dissociations between general cognition and language abilities. And I
Yeah.
wanted to know what those were.
Well, read the people who write about it, like Susan Curtis has extensive work on any kind of dissociation you can think of.
But those have mostly been debunked as far as I know.
Pardon?
So people have thought Williams syndrome was a dissociation.
She's not talking about that. She's
or
talking about
SLI.
no. She's talking about normal language use. Well, and in fact, the people with normal language use who have all kind of other incapacities, and conversely.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. But like what? Like Williams syndrome turns out not to be the case. They don't learn language until they're 14, which gives them a
Well,
cognitive age of 7.
Yeah, so there are cases where it's not true. There are cases where it is true. It's the cases where it is true that are interesting.
Can you name one?
Hmm?
Can you name one?
Yeah, take a look at her articles. I mean, I just gave you one. Autistic kids whose language is perfect and have no sense of shared intentionality. And, some of them have, say, fantastic arithmetical ability and no
Oh.
language. Yeah,
Well,
okay, that's, it goes almost any way you look. And there's plenty of studies of
so
this.
you think autistic kids have the perfect language despite?
No, because autistic, as I'm sure you know, is not a category. It's some kind of spectrum that's not understood. So there's what we call autism. There's all kind of different things. But there are children who are diagnosed as autistic, whatever that means. In fact, I know some who have language capacity is essentially perfect. You can't, maybe with some complicated experiments, you could show something they don't know. And they have no conception of how to deal with anyone else. They can't get along with anyone, Okay, and it works the other way. There are people kids who get along fine with everyone and don't speak. And there's every other kind of dissociation you like. No? Well, I think the literature is pretty strong on this. Okay, whatever you think. But even if there weren't dissociation, suppose there were none, still the proposals that, say, Tomasello is making are completely vacuous, because there is no way to get from shared intentionality or culture, whatever that is, to anything simple that you think of, say, structure dependence, to take the simplest thing. In fact, if you look at the work,
Well, there's pretty specific accounts of structure dependence.
He has?
Yeah.
0. His account is somehow we know subject predicate because of this and that and the other thing, so therefore we use structure-dependent rules, which doesn't have anything to do with the question. I mean, you can have a lot of the computational cognitive science work makes exactly the same mistake. They say, well, look, we have a way of getting hierarchy. That shows you use structure dependence. Doesn't show a thing. You can have hierarchy, in fact you must have hierarchy, still leaves the option of 2 methods of relating, say, instinctively to a verb in the case that I mentioned. One is linear order, that's available. The other is minimal structural distance. The fact that you have hierarchy doesn't tell you what you get. You have linear order too, so why don't you use that one? I mean, this work is just totally irrelevant. It doesn't think through the most elementary questions. Like, both of those options are there whether you have hierarchy or not. And say Tomasello is right in his kind of speculation that somehow you know subject and somehow you know predicate. All right, grant him that. Tells you nothing about why you don't use the linear order. Nothing. Doesn't even raise the question. And the same is true on every other property of language. Find one that isn't.
Well, people like Jackanoff have argued that you do use the order.
What?
People like Ray Jackanoff have argued that you do use linear order.
Not for things like this. That's in communication you sometimes do. Like there's the WH movement, let's say it's to the left and not to the right. Okay, that's linear order. So you look for reasons, they're probably pragmatic reasons. Ritchie has a lot of evidence about how linear order shows up. Okay, look at it. But the idea but it just doesn't bear on any of these topics. It doesn't. It bears on various ways. I mean, language use is a very complicated thing, has all kind of things interacting. You can find some which involve, emphasis, focus, some cases of, say, affronting of negation, which change things. Furthermore, incidentally, on this case, there happens to be direct and pretty interesting neurophysiological evidence that you can't use linear order in the core cases. The work that came out of the Milan group, do you know that? Well, the very interesting studies that came out of it's been replicated a lot by now, but about 10 years ago, a research group in Milan, Andrea Moro's the linguist involved, and they did some very straightforward experimental work. They took speakers of, I think, German, and gave them two kinds of nonsense language. One kind was modeled on some language they didn't know, but accorded with UG. The other involved extremely simple computational principles that aren't known in language. Like, for example, negating a sentence by putting the negative particle in the third word position. Well, they were just studying neural correlates. It turns out that when they give them the UG conforming nonsense, you get the normal activation in the language areas. When you give them the trivial computation, put the negation in the third word, say, it's a puzzle, people can solve it, but different areas of the brain are working. In fact, it's very diffuse, it's all over the brain. It's puzzle solving. And there's some experimental work that it's tricky, that conforms to this. Smith and Simpley's work with their, Chris, their sort of language genius. This is a guy who has essentially very low cognitive capacities. They have to help him go upstairs because you know where to go in the house where he lives. Almost nothing. But he learns language very quickly. Actually, it turns out he learns phonology and morphology very quickly, and lexicon. He learns those aspects of language. It looks as if he's learning syntax and semantics, but you look closely, probably not. It's just there, But he acquires languages very fast. They tried to teach him and a group of normals different languages. Some of them were some language neither of them knew. Okay, Chris acquired what looks like competence very quickly. He does it in no time, memorizes the dictionary, things like that. The normals had a problem, sometimes they finally solved the puzzle. Then they gave them, nonsense languages which same as Moro, did and did not violate UG. The ones that did violate UG, the normals treated it like some language they never heard of. They finally got it as a puzzle. Chris could do nothing. It's just because he can't solve puzzles. Okay, there's that kind of evidence. But I think the evidence is very strong. And quite apart from the evidence really doesn't matter, because there is no way to go from the kind of things that, say, Tomasello looks at to anything about language. It's just hand-waving. You say, okay, you do it by induction and analogy or, something else. That's nothing. That's what I meant by saying this stuff gives hand-waving a bad name. I think it really does. Try to work it out. That's pretty strong.
One more question.
Yeah.
You said that a perfect language system would satisfy the interface principles in the most optimal fashion. Is there a way to operationalize optimal, what that
Yeah.
means?
Well, first of all, I would like to qualify that because of what I said later. I think it should satisfy the CI level optimally, because the sensory motor system seems ancillary. Now, it has to satisfy that too, probably optimally, but it's going to be quite complicated. So the question is a fair question. What does optimally mean? Well, you know, we don't have a perfect theory of computational complexity. But computational complexity is used in biology and, in fact, for physics all the time, without a perfect theory of it, but some ideas about it, you know. And the way you refine these ideas is by seeing what works and asking, what does that tell you about computational complexity? So, and some of the ideas are quite simple. For example, less is better than more. Okay, less computation is better than more computation. Actually, that's alone is sufficient for everything I said. Or minimal search is better than deep search because it requires more complexity. What I call the no tampering condition, you know, you don't mess with the things you're merging, is more efficient than changing them. That's any theory of computation is going to have that property. Or eliminate copies on the way to externalization. That gives you a massive restriction of computation. Or to take another case that I didn't mention, it's kind of language internal here, but if you look at work on displacement, over the years it's been assumed by me too that displacement is somehow a complex property as distinct from what I call internal merge, is something complicated that you somehow have to explain away. It's a kind of an imperfection of language. And external merge, you know, just putting two things together is straightforward. Actually, it's the opposite, it turns out. If you think about it, external merge requires a lot more computation than internal merge. Technically, external merge requires searching the entire space of accessible objects, you know, the whole lexicon, the whole workspace, and big search program. And then you can put together C and John, you know. Internal merge is much simpler. You're looking at one object, you're picking what's technically a term of it, that's a well-defined notion, and you're merging that to the whole object. That's straightforward. But there's a lot of literature arguing, good linguists, that copies should be, that internal merge should be replaced by external merge. So take, what did you see, what? Okay. The argument is, well, you just generate, you see what, and then you take what, which you've generated outside, and you externally merge them. That's a very bad idea for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it requires, for one thing, it requires a stipulation. You have to block internal merge, which is free. That's like blocking any other thing that comes free. Second is it involves a huge amount of computation. Everything that's displaced has to be independently generated, and it can be of arbitrary complexity, and it can be present arbitrarily many times in the construction, and you got to do all that computation instead of doing a very elementary computation. Take a term of an object and merge it. Now, any theory of computation is going to at least meet that condition. And I think you can generalize. This is instantly true in other parts of biology. So, for example, if you look at, say, I don't know if you know Chris Cherniak's work on optimizing neural networks, he's done interesting work showing that if you take very simple organisms like, you know, nematodes, a couple hundred neurons, and you look at the wiring diagram's known, you know everything about how they're connected. You know nothing about what the damn thing is doing, but that's another problem. But he's shown, I think, pretty convincingly that you can predict the wiring diagram by a principle of computation, which essentially is the same principle that's used in building transistors, a minimized wire length. Because if you minimize total wire length, you get the nematode. He argues that may extend to the fact that vertebrates have the brain at one end, not in the middle, you know, things like that. Well, that's good work, but why that principle of computation? You could think of others. Well, that's the way science works. You try to find sensible principles that make sense, see if they work. You can ask, well, are there other principles that don't work? What's the difference between them? Can I refine the theory? So it's a good question, but I think it's a research question. And for our purposes, at least at this primitive stage of language study, just obvious properties of complexity work, like less is better than more.
So you want to equate efficiency and optimality?
The same thing, the two words for something we're searching for. We're searching for the general principle of biology and maybe of the natural world that tries to make things simple. And you know, that goes back to the origin. That's all of science. So take, say, Galileo. I mean, the principle that he proposed for the sciences and that everybody follows since is we have to believe that nature is simple, maybe because God made it that way. Nature is simple, and it's the task of the scientist to prove it. If you can't prove it, you're wrong. And all of the sciences are based on this. You know, you throw that out, you're just collecting data. In fact, you're not even collecting data, because even to collect data requires prior assumptions about what is data. So it's asking a good question, but it's a general question about the nature of human inquiry. And it does show up in cases like this, and sometimes you might find real examples, like say with Cherniak, is there another mode of computation? With structure dependence, is there another mode? And if you can find alternative proposals about optimization, good. Then you search, you try to distinguish them on some other grounds. But it's a research question. You can't answer it a priori. You can start with reasonable a priori assumptions, which get you pretty far, but you have to be willing to question them later on, because they could be wrong. You know. But that's just inquiry. You can't get around those problems.
Okay, thank you very much.